The baby deer blocked her cruiser. What it led her to made every officer cry. The morning fog hung thick over the winding mountain road like a veil of secrets, blurring the edges of pine trees and swallowing sound into silence. Cars lined up in both directions, engines idling, headlights cutting through the mist with little effect. At the front of the jam, people stood outside their vehicles, phones in hand, unsure whether to laugh or worry. There it was, just standing there, a baby deer, trembling but unmoving, planted firmly in the center of the asphalt like it belonged there. Its legs were thin, almost too fragile to carry its small frame, but its eyes, wide, dark, glistening with something unnameable, were locked not on the cars or the people but the mountain itself. As if waiting for something to arrive, Officer Helen Carter pulled up in her cruiser. Sirens off, lights rotating gently through the fog. She stepped out slowly, instinctively placing her palm over the holster at her waist but not unhooking it. At 37, Helen had seen her share of strange calls, runaways, meth labs, a black bear in a drive-through once, but never this. A baby deer stopping traffic in the middle of Route 61. With a look like it had something to say, a man in a flannel shirt gestured toward the fawn. Been standing there for 15 minutes. Won't budge. It don't look sick or scared. It just keeps looking up that hill. Helen didn't respond. She was already looking into the deer's eyes. There was something wrong, or right, or different. She took a careful step forward, and the deer flinched but didn't run. Another step. Nothing. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward the edge of the forest and took 3 tentative steps. Paused, looked back at her. That's when she knew. It wasn't just blocking traffic. It wasn't just lost. It was waiting for someone to follow. And in the quiet hum of dawn, Helen Carter, veteran, officer, skeptic, felt the strange certainty that she had to go. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we bring you real stories that flicker with mystery, hope, and the unexpected connections that change everything. If you're someone who believes that even in the darkest places, a single spark can make all the difference, you're in the right place. Before we dive into today's cinematic tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep uncovering and telling these powerful stories, ones that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Helen Carter had never liked the sound of her own footsteps echoing through silence. But in these mountains, that sound had become familiar. 37, steady as steel, with a history carved by years in uniform. First in the military, then behind the badge, she had returned to her hometown in West Virginia after deployments that left too many scars to count and a weariness that no city could soothe. The Appalachians were in her blood. She was raised in the valleys, taught to shoot by her grandfather, to respect nature by her mother, and to fear it by the night. People around here didn't call for help unless they had to. Which was why, when dispatch mentioned an animal in the road, she almost ignored it. But something in the officer's voice, something off script, made her listen. The winters in Appalachia didn't come with howling blizzards. They came quietly, with fog, frost-bitten mornings, and the kind of stillness that felt like the land was holding its breath. The roads snaked through thickets of pine and bare oak, twisting just enough to make you lose your bearings. Helen knew these roads the way some people knew hymns. They held memories, warnings, the scent of fallen leaves and burning wood. That morning, the cold had crept in deep. Her breath turned to vapor inside the cruiser, and the thermos of coffee on the passenger seat had already gone lukewarm. She tightened the strap on her utility vest. Not out of nervousness but habit. Her fingers, always deliberate, checked her sidearm, the flashlight, the backup radio. She had learned to prepare for everything, including nothing, which made it all the more unsettling when she remembered Billy. 2 days ago, 8-year-old Billy Hammond had vanished from his backyard. His mother had turned away for just a minute. The property backed into a dense woodland, and it had been raining for hours. By the time the neighbors realized he was missing, the trails had turned to mud, the sky to slate, and the wind made it impossible to hear anything more than the sound of your own name being whispered back by the trees. The search parties had combed through the woods for nearly 36 hours. No prints, no calls returned, just a single red rain boot found in a gully near a dried creek bed. Helen had been part of the second day's sweep. She didn't cry easily, but the sight of the mother sitting on the porch wrapped in her husband's oversized coat, clutching the other boot, had put a knot in her chest that still hadn't loosened. She knew how this story usually ended. The forest was ancient and indifferent. It didn't keep secrets. It swallowed them, but now, standing on that 2-lane mountain road, staring at a baby deer that wouldn't move, wouldn't run, she felt something shift. Not logic, not protocol, something older. Her grandfather once said that the animals out here saw more than people did. That sometimes, if you were quiet enough, they'd tell you what they knew. Helen had always chalked it up to old man folklore. But today, with fog curling around her boots and the deer still watching her with those wet, unreadable eyes, she wondered if maybe he had been right. She stepped closer. The deer backed away but didn't bolt. It turned its head toward the trees, paused, then glanced back. It did it again, and again, like it was waiting, like it was asking her to follow. She pulled her radio but didn't press the call button. Who would she even tell? That a deer wanted her to go into the woods? That it felt like the boy everyone had already started mourning might not be gone? It was foolish, dangerous, but something in her, the part of her that had survived explosions, ambushes, and endless bureaucracy, told her to trust it. She took a deep breath, then another, and then, without another word, she stepped off the pavement and into the trees. Following the only guide she had, Helen moved cautiously, each footstep crunching into the damp underbrush like a whisper pressed too hard. The fawn kept just far enough ahead to stay untouchable, but never so far that she couldn't see it. It would take a few paces, stop, glance over its shoulder, and wait. If she slowed, it slowed. When she stopped to listen, it froze. There was an unspoken rhythm between them, as though it somehow knew she was following not out of curiosity but out of something deeper. And whatever instinct brought her into these woods now hummed louder than training or reason ever could. The forest swallowed sound like it had something to hide. No birdsong, no wind, just the soft, muted echo of her boots over moss and fallen needles. Trees rose like silent sentinels, bare limbs scratching at the sky, casting long gray fingers across the forest floor. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. The kind of cold that crawled under the skin and settled in the bones. The kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat. The fawn paused at the crest of a slope. It looked back again, and this time, its head tilted ever so slightly, as if urging her forward. Helen didn't speak. She didn't dare. She climbed the slope slowly, brushing aside low branches, and when she reached the top, the forest opened just enough to reveal a narrow path choked with leaves. That's when she saw it, hanging on a broken branch at eye level. A child's shirt. It was torn at the sleeve, dirty, the cartoon print on the front faded from wear and weather. But it was unmistakably a boy's shirt. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, gently freeing it from the branch, careful not to rip it further. Her fingers brushed over the fabric. It was damp but not frozen, not yet stiff from exposure, which meant it hadn't been here long. Her eyes scanned the forest floor, suddenly sharper, and there they were. Partial footprints, tiny ones, the heel of one, the ball of another, smeared by wet earth but still visible enough to tell her they didn't belong to any adult. No boot treads, just the flat rubbery outline of a small sneaker. They led forward, almost exactly in the same direction the fawn had been guiding her. She crouched, her gloved hand brushing the edge of a print, then touching the soil beside it, waterlogged but not freshly rained on. These steps weren't made today. Maybe yesterday, maybe the night before. She stood and moved quicker now, her steps more deliberate. The fawn had disappeared behind a thicket of undergrowth, but she could hear it moving just ahead, its tiny hooves clicking gently against stone. The path twisted, narrowed, then widened again into a shallow glade where light trickled in through gaps in the treetops, and there, lying half buried beneath fallen pine needles, was a small blue glove. She didn't have to pick it up to know. The name was right there, stitched in tiny faded letters along the wrist. Billy. Her breath hitched. Her heart lurched against her ribs like it was trying to claw its way out. She picked up the glove with trembling fingers. It was damp, soft, not frozen. She fumbled for her radio, but the signal bar blinked red. Nothing. Too deep in the woods. She took a slow breath, calming her pulse, anchoring herself in the way she had been taught during combat patrols. One breath. Then two. Then she began to mark her position mentally. mapping the turns she had taken. The slope, the branch with the shirt. She dropped the glove into a small evidence bag and zipped it shut. Her fingers steady again. Something cracked in the distance. Not the deer. Heavier. She turned sharply, hand drifting to the grip of her weapon. But there was nothing. Only trees. Only shadows. Only the fawn, now visible again through a break in the trees. Staring at her, she walked toward it. And it moved once more. This time faster. As if time was running out. Helen followed. Branches slapping against her uniform. Brambles tugging at her legs. The path dipped again, leading into a rocky trench where the air turned colder still. She stepped over a fallen log, ducked under another, and then stopped. Something else lay ahead. Something pale against the forest floor. She moved slowly, heart thudding. It was a second glove. The match, laid carefully beside a half-eaten granola bar, still in its torn wrapper. It hadn't been touched by animals. That was strange. Even out here, squirrels or raccoons would have devoured it by now. Which meant something had been guarding it. A low sound reached her ears then. A soft grunt. Not animal. Human. Weak. She froze. The fawn stood nearby, completely still. Its ears perked forward. Helen reached into her vest for the flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed the beam through the trees just beyond the roots of an uprooted oak. Barely visible beneath a mess of leaves and wet bark was the unmistakable shape of a small figure curled up tight, arms tucked to the chest, legs folded beneath, a backpack beside him. She stepped forward, careful not to startle whatever life remained. "Billy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The boy stirred. His head turned just enough for her to see the cracked lips, the dirt-caked cheeks, the wide, sunken eyes blinking in the beam of her light. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He just looked at her, like he wasn't sure she was real. Helen dropped to her knees, pulled off her gloves, and reached out slowly. He didn't pull away. His skin was icy, but he was breathing, faint, shallow, but alive. She exhaled, trembling, and reached again for the radio, lifting it above her head, searching for even a flicker of signal. Still nothing. She didn't care. She wrapped the boy in her outer jacket, pulled him close to her chest, and looked up at the fawn. It stood only a few feet away now, closer than ever, watching, not with fear, with intent. Helen didn't believe in miracles, but at that moment, kneeling in the frozen woods, clutching a boy no one expected to be found, she stopped needing to believe, because something had just happened that didn't need explanation, only acknowledgement. The forest had answered, through hooves, through silence, through something not quite wild and not quite tame. And she had listened. Helen raised the radio again, knuckles white against the grip, pressing down hard on the button. Static cracked in her ear. A flicker of signal, then silence. She turned in a slow circle, held the device toward the sky, tilted it, walked a few paces uphill. But the screen kept blinking red. She cursed under her breath. No bars, no backup, just her, the boy barely clinging to consciousness in her arms, and the fawn standing a few feet away, still watching, still waiting. She didn't have time to argue with reality. Her training kicked in, but so did something else. Something raw, instinctual. She couldn't leave him here, and she couldn't wait. She shifted Billy carefully into her arms, securing him close to her chest, letting her body heat bleed into his. His breath was shallow but steady. His fingers twitched when her hand brushed his. And that was enough. She stood slowly, keeping her knees loose against the uneven forest floor, then looked at the deer. It met her eyes for only a second, then turned and walked, not ran, walked, as if it understood the weight she carried, as if it had been waiting for her to be ready. The forest changed the deeper they moved. The air grew colder, and the snow, which had started as a light whisper in the treetops, now fell heavier. The flakes caught in Helen's lashes, melted into her collar. The ground softened beneath her boots, turning to slush and mud. Every step sucked at her soles like the earth itself was reluctant to let her pass. The fawn remained ahead, moving with a patience that didn't seem natural. From time to time, it would let out a low, almost mournful sound, like a whimper made of breath. A cry, not for help, but for urgency. Branches clawed at her shoulders. Her legs burned from the strain. Billy stirred once, murmured something she couldn't understand, and then fell silent again. His body, too light, too cold, felt like time slipping through her fingers. But the deer never stopped. It paused at forks in the trail, waited for her to catch up, then kept going, winding through dense thickets, between trees twisted by winter and time. Then the wind changed. The forest exhaled something new, a bitter scent of damp soil and uprooted earth. Helen blinked through the falling snow. Up ahead, the trees fell away into a broken clearing. The ground sloped sharply down, like a wound torn through the forest. Roots jutted from the exposed dirt like bones. A landslide, recent, the kind you didn't see until it was too late. The fawn stood at the edge of the drop, its ears alert, body trembling not from fear but anticipation. It made that low sound again, this time sharper, more insistent. Helen approached carefully, knees bent, adjusting Billy against her shoulder. She peered over the edge, her breath catching in her throat. The slope dipped steeply into a natural bowl of collapsed forest floor. Trees lay broken like matchsticks, branches strewn like wreckage, and there, barely visible beneath a mound of soggy leaves, something moved, a hand, small, covered in dirt and scratches. Reaching, Helen's breath stilled. It was impossible. She looked down at the boy in her arms, then back at the hand. Another child, another life. She knelt at the edge, eyes scanning for stability, then shouted, her voice cutting clean through the quiet. "Hold on, I see you, I'm coming." The hand trembled. Leaves shifted. A face peeped out, pale, streaked with grime, tears mixed with blood, and eyes, wide, terrified. Still alive, she gently set Billy down beneath a tree, using her coat to cushion him, tucking dry branches around him for insulation. He whimpered once in protest but didn't open his eyes. Helen whispered to him, promised she'd be right back, then turned back to the edge of the pit. The descent looked brutal, loose soil, sharp rocks, but it didn't matter. She moved fast, hands gripping exposed roots, boots sliding through the mud halfway down. She slipped, caught herself, then pressed forward, reaching the child in seconds that felt like hours. A girl, younger than Billy, maybe 5, shivering uncontrollably, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. But she was conscious, clinging to something in her hand. A scarf, probably her brother's. Helen crouched beside her, checked for other injuries, whispered soft, steady things to keep her calm. The girl stared at her like she wasn't real, like no one had come until now. Helen reached for the radio again. Still dead. She scanned the slope, too steep to carry both kids up at once. She had to make a choice. Then she heard it. Another sound, not from the girl, not from Billy, but from above, the fawn. It stood at the top of the slope, calling again, louder, more urgent. Then it turned and darted into the woods. Helen felt something shift, not fear, not hope, a knowing. She had done her part. Now it was time for something else to find them. She cradled the girl against her chest, murmured reassurances, and started the climb. It took everything she had. Her arms screamed, her legs buckled more than once. But she reached the top, set the girl beside Billy, covered both with everything she had. The storm thickened, but far off, faint, almost too distant to trust, came a sound. Not the deer this time. Radios, voices, barking, dogs. She stood, eyes scanning the blur of snow and shadow. And there, cutting through the trees, bright and unmistakable, flashlights. Help had come, but it hadn't started with a call, not with protocol. It started with a creature born in silence, who didn't run from danger but led someone straight into it, toward life, toward something left to be saved. Helen didn't hesitate. She took one last glance toward the tree line where the rescue lights were still distant flickers, then turned back to the ravine. There was no time. Billy was barely conscious, his pulse thready beneath her fingers, his skin pale and growing colder by the minute. The little girl beside him whimpered in her sleep, too weak to cry. Helen stripped off her vest, looped it around Billy's chest, securing the makeshift sling across her shoulder, and then began her descent into the pit. The soil was soft and treacherous beneath her boots, a blend of mud, snow, and loosened earth that slid under pressure. Her hands gripped exposed roots and jagged rock, using every inch of muscle memory honed from years of crawling through terrain far less forgiving. She reached the bottom in seconds that felt like forever, her breath sharp in her lungs, Billy didn't respond when she touched his cheek, but his body twitched. A tiny response, enough to push her forward. She worked quickly, stabilizing his leg with a pair of sticks and her belt. Wrapping his body in her outer coat, snow began to fall heavier, a curtain of white swallowing the forest. The temperature dropped fast. Her hands were numb by the time she lifted him into her arms and began the slow climb back. The slope that had been manageable an hour ago was now slick with ice. Every step upward was a gamble. She braced her shoulder against the wall of earth, leaned into the climb, one boot up, then the other. At halfway, her foot slipped. She slammed against the side of the ravine, shielding Billy's head with her forearm. Her ribs screamed with the impact, but she didn't stop. Couldn't. Her fingers clawed at frozen dirt, found a solid root, pulled, then again, until her breath came in ragged bursts and the cold bit through every layer she wore. Her mind tunneled. One thought, one focus: get him out, get him safe. She didn't hear the deer approach, didn't notice it until a faint rustle behind her caught her attention. She glanced up. There it was, at the top of the slope again. But this time, it was holding something. In its mouth, dangling from a corner, was a small knitted scarf, pink and white, frayed at the ends. She knew it before she even reached the top. She had seen that scarf 2 days ago, draped over the shoulders of Billy's grandmother on the porch as she begged them to find her grandson. It had belonged to Billy as a baby. She'd used it to swaddle him on cold nights. Helen's chest tightened. The deer laid it down gently on the snow and backed away. She reached the top, collapsed beside the children, pulled the scarf close. It was warm, faintly, as if it had been somewhere alive, somewhere human, somewhere safe. That scarf didn't come from here. Not from the woods, not from a lost trail. The deer had gone back. It had known where to go, and it had returned with a reminder that home was still waiting. That Billy still had a place to go back to. She wrapped the scarf around his neck, tucking it beneath her jacket. His breathing hitched, just a little, enough. She crouched over both children, shielding them as the storm thickened. Her radio crackled, barely audible, then a voice. Dispatch. Broken words through static. Search team approaching. ETA minutes. Helen pressed the button, voice steady despite the cold. 2 children, both alive. Bring medics. They're fading fast. Then she looked at the deer. It stood still, snow gathering on its back. Those eyes locked onto hers, not with fear, but with knowing. Then it turned and walked back into the forest without sound, fading into the trees like it had never been there at all. Helen stayed with the kids until the flashing lights broke through the treetops. The moment before the paramedics reached her, Billy stirred. His lips moved, too soft to hear, but Helen saw the shape of the word. Nana. She smiled through the tears that had started to freeze on her cheeks. He wasn't gone. Not today. Not on her watch. Not with that creature guiding the way like it had known from the very beginning that something worth saving still waited in the cold. Billy lay in the hospital bed with the sunlight cutting soft lines across the blanket. His skin still pale but warmer now. His breath steady beneath the wires and monitors. Helen stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, boots still caked with dried mud from the forest. She hadn't said much since the paramedics took over, since the heat packs were wrapped around his hands, since the IV dripped warmth back into his veins. She'd stayed quiet, waiting, watching, letting it all settle, until now. Billy's voice was small, dry, but clear. He was speaking to his grandmother, her hand resting on his, her eyes never leaving his face. It came back, he said, the little deer. His grandmother froze for a second. Not disbelief, but something older, recognition. He looked at Helen then, and she stepped closer. It used to come near the porch sometimes. Mom said it was the same one she found last spring stuck in the fence out by the cornfield. Its leg was bleeding and she cut the wire and helped it walk back into the woods. His eyes softened. She told me not to feed it, not to pet it, said it needed to stay wild. Helen listened, didn't interrupt. The boy went on, his words gaining strength. Sometimes I'd see it in the mornings, just standing there near the tree line, watching. Then it would go, not scared, just waiting. I think it liked us. He looked down at the scarf in his lap, freshly washed but still frayed at the ends. That night when I got lost, it was the one who found me. I was so cold and scared and my flashlight broke. I didn't know where to go. I curled up and cried. And then I heard something moving. I thought it was a coyote. He smiled faintly, but it was just the deer. It didn't leave. It laid down next to me. It was warm. I think it stayed there all night. Helen nodded slowly. It did more than that. Billy tilted his head. It went to find you? She didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. The truth was written in every step she'd taken after that creature appeared. Every glance it gave, every moment it stopped and waited, just long enough to make her believe the grandmother wiped a tear from her cheek. Your mother said animals remember kindness. I never knew what she meant until now. Helen leaned on the windowsill, her gaze drifting to the trees beyond the parking lot. The forest stood still, ancient, unmoved by the hospital lights and the traffic below. But somewhere in there, she knew, it was still watching, not with hunger, not with fear, with memory. The story spread quickly after that. Nurses whispered, reporters circled, wildlife officials came with questions and cameras. But the deer was never found again. Not exactly. Prints were seen near the Hammond property. Tufts of fur caught on low branches. But never a direct sighting. It was as if the woods had reclaimed it. People called it the guardian fawn. Others called it the spirit of the ridge. But the locals, those who knew the land, called it something simpler. The forest's thank you. Helen didn't argue. She didn't need to define what had happened. She had lived it. And when Billy looked at her with those clear eyes and said, "It didn't forget we helped it," she realized something deeper. Nature doesn't speak our language. But it remembers. It remembers hands that cut wire, feet that walked carefully, eyes that didn't look away when something fragile stood in the middle of the road and asked, without words, for help. The fawn had crossed more than just a highway. It had crossed the impossible, the invisible line between instinct and intention. And in doing so, it had done what no one else could. It brought someone back. It kept something alive. Helen left the hospital that evening without fanfare. She didn't need it. The truth was already growing. Not in headlines, but in the quiet way people now looked toward the trees with something softer in their eyes. And somewhere deep in the woods, between the broken slope and the trail of half-remembered footprints, a small creature stood still and listened, just long enough to know the job was done. Months passed. Winter loosened its grip on the mountains and spring crept in quietly, softening the trees, thawing the soil, bringing with it a slow return to life. The story of the boy, the officer, and the deer had long since broken past county lines. News stations replayed footage of the rescue. Headlines called it a miracle. And photographs of Billy with the knitted scarf draped across his shoulders spread through every corner of the internet. But beneath all the noise, something real had begun to grow. The local wildlife center, overwhelmed by the public's response, partnered with conservation groups and quietly began building something new. Not just a sanctuary, but a space for stories. They called it the Sanctuary of Silent Bonds, nestled deep in a protected stretch of forest just beyond the edge of town. It was designed not as a zoo, not as a spectacle, but as a refuge, for animals that had known both the wild and the hand of a human. For people who had lost something and come to find it again in the stillness of nature. It became a place where silence spoke louder than explanation, where children listened not to lectures but to the hush between trees, and where kindness, unspoken and unseen, echoed louder than applause. Helen never asked to be the face of anything. She still patrolled the same roads, drank the same bad coffee, ran the same drills at the range. But she was different, not softer, just clearer. She visited the sanctuary sometimes, usually without notice, walking its trails alone. She never strayed far, just enough to hear the wind in the branches and feel the earth beneath her feet. Billy visited too. He'd healed fast, like kids do, but what stayed with him wasn't fear. It was memory. And the deer, the one no one could ever quite track or tag, was seen only once more. It appeared at dusk near the outer fence of the sanctuary as workers were finishing the final enclosure. It stood still for nearly 10 minutes, watching the land it had somehow helped shape, then turned and disappeared into the trees. They never caught it. They never tried. People started calling it the Little Watcher. No name, no number, just a presence, a whisper between roots and leaves. In time, it became something more than a story. Teachers brought classrooms, Survivors brought silence. Families brought their children. And in the center of it all stood a bronze statue. Small and simple. A child, sitting cross-legged, hand outstretched. And beside him, a deer, eyes lifted, as if listening to something only the forest could hear. Helen stood before it once. Alone. Long after the ribbon had been cut and the speeches faded. She didn't cry, but she remembered. Not the cameras. Not the headlines. Just a pair of eyes in the middle of the road. Eyes that had asked nothing. Promised nothing. And yet had changed everything. Sometimes, she thought, the world doesn't shout to be saved. Sometimes, it just waits. And sometimes, when you're quiet enough to hear it, you realize the smallest voice can lead you back to the most important things.